Welcome to our deep dive today. We're going to try to create a psychological profile of John Wayne Gacy,
Okay.
the infamous serial killer.
Right.
We're going to be using an academic case study as our guide.
Okay.
Um, you probably already know the basics of his crimes, but our mission today is to kind of go deeper, to really unpack what motivated Gacy, and identify any patterns or warning signs that may have been there,
Right.
and why this is relevant for you. Well, gating these insights into the mind of someone like Gacy can actually help us better understand human behavior and motivations,
Yeah.
like even in a broader sense, even beyond just criminal psychology.
Absolutely. I think that's a really important point. It's not to sensationalize, but to understand. We can learn a lot about just human behavior in general
Yeah.
from these extreme cases.
So let's start at the beginning.
Okay.
Gacy's childhood.
Okay.
The case study describes it as turbulent, to say the least.
Yes. His early years were marked by significant trauma. His father, an alcoholic, was incredibly abusive, both physically and emotionally. And Gacy desperately craved his father's approval, but never got it.
Oh. I can imagine that yearning for that validation
Yeah.
must really impacted his personality.
Absolutely. It likely contributed to this deep-seated feelings of inadequacy
Oh, yeah.
and a need for control that we see play out in his later life.
Right.
And the abuse wasn't limited to just his father. Gacy was also bullied
Oh,
for being overweight,
of course.
further kind of eroding his self-esteem.
Yeah, but there's one incident that really stands out to me.
Okay.
The sexual abuse by a family friend
Right.
when Gacy was only 7 years old.
Yes. This was a horrific trauma that Gacy kept hidden for years, probably out of fear of his father's reaction. And the case study suggests that this unresolved trauma may have been a major contributing factor to his psychological development.
It makes you think about that cycle of violence theory,
Yeah.
how early abuse can increase the likelihood of somebody becoming violent themselves.
Exactly. And it's important to emphasize this is not deterministic.
Right.
Not everyone who experiences abuse is going to go on to become an abuser
Right.
or a criminal, but it does raise the risk.
It seems like a nature and nurture situation.
Yeah.
Speaking of nature, the case study also mentions the MAOA gene.
Yeah.
Like, what is that?
Yeah. So there's been some research suggesting a possible link between this gene and variations of it and aggressive behavior,
Okay.
particularly when it's combined with a traumatic childhood. It's still a relatively new area of research.
Right.
But it is fascinating to consider the interplay of genetic predisposition
Yeah.
and environmental factors.
So we have this incredibly troubled childhood.
Yeah.
But then as Gacy reaches his teenage years, things take a surprising turn.
That's right. He undergoes this significant transformation. Becomes popular,
Wow.
well-liked, even involved in politics.
Really?
He was a respected member of the Jaceys. It's pretty remarkable.
Yeah, that is fascinating. It seems almost impossible that somebody could have such a difficult childhood and then become so, socially successful.
Right.
Was he genuinely overcoming his past? Or was this just some kind of calculated facade to mask his inner turmoil?
That's the question, isn't it?
Yeah.
Was he truly overcoming this past or just burying it beneath this carefully constructed persona?
Especially considering he was diagnosed later with antisocial personality disorder,
Right.
which often involves psychopathic traits.
Precisely. And psychopaths are often described as being really charming and manipulative.
Mm.
They're incredibly skilled at presenting this false self
Yeah.
to the world.
It's a bit unsettling to think that charisma and that ability to connect with people could also be a tool of deception.
It is a chilling thought, but it's a reality we have to confront when we study people like this.
Yeah. There's one incident from his early 20s detailed in the case study
Okay.
that I find particularly disturbing. It involves his time working at a mortuary.
Ah, yes. The incident with the male corpse.
It's described as a turning point where his darker impulses seem to surface.
It does seem that way. The lack of any significant emotional response afterwards is something that I always find particularly noteworthy.
Yeah.
I mean, this lack of empathy
Yeah.
is a classic psychopathic trait, and perhaps this was a moment when those traits started to manifest more overtly.
It's almost as if he was testing the boundaries of his psyche,
Yeah.
seeing how far he could push things without feeling anything.
Right.
But there's another incident from this period that I think is also relevant.
Okay.
An incident with a colleague.
You're referring to the colleague who performed oral sex on Gacy after getting him drunk.
Yes. The case study suggests that this may have been another traumatic experience,
Right.
particularly because it involved alcohol and was never reported.
That's a really important detail, I think. If this experience was, in fact, traumatic for Gacy, it adds another layer of complexity to his psychological profile. You know, these suppressed experiences combined with his already troubled past could have created this kind of pressure cooker inside him.
A pressure cooker that eventually had to find release.
Perhaps. And that release, as we know, took a pretty horrific form.
So it's almost unbelievable. After all of that, the tumultuous upbringing, those disturbing early experiences, Gacy goes on to project this image of normalcy.
Right.
He gets married twice, becomes a successful manager, active in his community, and even performs as a clown.
Yeah, I mean, it's that construction of a facade is something we often see in individuals with antisocial personality disorder, particularly those who exhibit psychopathic traits. It's like they're creating this mask to hide their true selves from the world.
So was all of this just an elaborate cover for his crimes? Was Pogo the Clown just a way to lure victims and deflect suspicion?
It's likely more nuanced than that.
Okay.
Well, it's possible that he used his good guy persona to manipulate and gain trust. We also have to consider the psychological factors at play.
Yeah.
The need for control, thrill of deception, the desire to fit in and be seen as normal. These are all powerful motivators, especially for someone with Gacy's personality structure.
You mentioned earlier that not everybody with antisocial personality disorder becomes a serial killer.
Right.
So what was it about Gacy that led him down this particular path?
That's a complex question. There's no easy answer.
Yeah.
But if we look at the case study, there are some clues.
Okay.
His first murder, which he claimed was an accident, seems to have been a turning point.
Okay.
He described the experience as the ultimate thrill, suggesting that something shifted within him at that moment.
So it wasn't just about power or control anymore. It was something more sinister.
Yeah. That's a possible interpretation.
Yeah.
It aligns with a theory known as the under-arousal hypothesis, which suggests that psychopaths experience lower levels of physiological arousal than the average person. So they seek out these intense, often risky or deviant experiences to achieve a level of stimulation that most people would find unpleasant or disturbing.
And for Gacy, that stimulation became murder.
Tragically, yes. And his methods were particularly brutal, often involving torture and prolonged suffering. It's almost as if he was deriving pleasure from his victims' fear and pain.
It's just horrific to think about. The case study also mentions that he kept personal items from his victims.
Right.
What's the significance of that?
That's a detail that has been debated among experts.
Okay.
Some see it as evidence of fetishistic behavior, while others believe it was simply a result of his sloppy disposal methods. It's hard to say for sure.
Right.
But it does add another layer of complexity to his profile.
You mentioned sloppy disposal methods, and that brings up something that has always surprised me about this case. Despite this carefully constructed facade, his seemingly successful life, Gacy was incredibly careless in covering up his crimes.
You're right. He buried bodies on his own property, left behind witnesses, made numerous contradictory statements to the police.
So he wasn't the criminal mastermind type?
Not exactly.
Okay.
He was cunning and manipulative in some ways, but ultimately his recklessness and arrogance led to his downfall.
Which eventually leads to his diagnosis of antisocial personality disorder during his trial.
Yes, and this diagnosis helped to solidify what was already becoming clear. Gacy was wired differently.
Right.
His disregard for others, lack of remorse, deceitful nature, impulsivity, history of criminal behavior, all of these pointed to a deeply ingrained personality disorder.
It's important to remember, though, that a diagnosis doesn't excuse behavior.
Absolutely. It's a tool for understanding, not a justification.
Yeah.
But it does raise an important question. If Gacy's early trauma had been addressed, if he had received the psychological help he needed as a child, could his path have been different?
It's a haunting question, and one that highlights the critical importance of early intervention, addressing childhood abuse and mental health issues.
Yes.
We may never know for sure if Gacy's fate could have been altered.
Right.
But it's a chilling reminder of the potential consequences of neglecting these critical areas.
And we also can't forget the victims.
Right.
I mean, Gacy's crimes had a devastating impact on their families and loved ones, and those wounds run deep.
His victims were all young men.
Right.
Often lured to his home under false pretenses. This predatory nature, coupled with his use of the Pogo the Clown persona,
Yeah.
just adds another layer of perversity to this case.
Yeah.
It's a stark reminder that evil can often hide behind a friendly face,
Exactly.
behind a seemingly harmless mask.
And that's one of the most unsettling aspects of this case. I mean, it challenges our assumptions about good and evil.
Right.
And it forces us to confront this uncomfortable reality that darkness can really lurk in the most unexpected places.
So after he was caught, what happened?
Oh, well,
This must have been a huge news story.
absolutely. Gacy's trial became a media sensation, captivating the nation with the sheer horror of his crimes.
And I imagine the evidence was pretty overwhelming.
It was, with the bodies buried on his property, the witness testimonies, his own contradictory statement. I mean, there was no doubt about his guilt.
So what was the verdict?
He was convicted on 33 counts of murder and sentenced to death.
I know he spent years on death row. Did his behavior change at all after being convicted?
Not really. He continued to manipulate and deceive, even claiming innocence, until the very end.
Which, again, speaks to his psychopathic nature, that complete lack of remorse, the inability to take responsibility for his actions. It's as though he simply couldn't or wouldn't face the reality of what he had done.
It does paint a very bleak picture of his internal landscape.
Yeah.
There seemed to be this fundamental disconnect between his actions and his ability to process their consequences.
Right.
Both for himself and for others.
So what ultimately happened to John Wayne Gacy?
He was executed in 1994, bringing a final, albeit delayed, sense of justice to his victims and their families.
Yeah, it's hard to believe that even after all these years, Gacy's name still evokes such a strong reaction.
It really does.
His case really captured the public's attention,
Yeah.
both for the horrifying nature of his crimes, but also for that unsettling fact that he was able to blend in so well, appear to be an upstanding member of society.
You're absolutely right. I mean, it's the ultimate betrayal of trust. This was a man who was, on the surface, a successful businessman, a friendly neighbor, even someone who entertained children as a clown. And yet, underneath that carefully crafted facade, he was capable of these unspeakable acts of violence.
Yeah, it's a stark reminder that we can't always judge a book by its cover.
Yeah.
Evil doesn't always present itself in a way that's easy to recognize. It can be hidden in plain sight.
Exactly. And that's one of the reasons I think why Gacy's case continues to fascinate and horrify people to this day. It forces us to confront this uncomfortable reality that we can't always predict who is capable of violence.
So as we wrap up our deep dive into the psychological profile of John Wayne Gacy, what are some of the key takeaways? What can we learn from this dark chapter?
I think one of the most important takeaways is the critical importance of early intervention.
Yeah.
We've seen how Gacy's childhood was marked by significant trauma, abuse, and neglect. And while it's impossible to say for sure, it's hard not to wonder if things might have been different if those early experiences had been addressed. If he had received the psychological help he needed, might he have been able to break free from that cycle of pain and violence?
Yeah. It's a haunting question, and one that underscores the need for greater awareness of childhood trauma and its potential long-term consequences. We need to create a culture where people feel safe to seek help and where mental health issues are not stigmatized.
I completely agree. And along with addressing those issues, I think we also need to be more aware of the potential warning signs of psychopathy,
Okay.
especially in adults. Things like superficial charm, a lack of empathy, manipulative behavior, impulsivity, a disregard for rules, and a history of criminal behavior can all be red flags.
It's not about being suspicious of everyone we meet, right?
Right.
It's more about being informed and aware, trusting our instincts,
Exactly.
and being willing to speak up if something feels wrong.
It's about empowering ourselves and others to recognize potentially dangerous situations and take steps to protect ourselves.
Well, this deep dive has been both unsettling and incredibly insightful.
It has.
It's forced us to confront some difficult truths about human nature.
Yeah. But I believe that by understanding the dark psychology of individuals like John Wayne Gacy, we can gain valuable insights into the complexities of human behavior. And ultimately, that knowledge can help us to create a safer and more compassionate world.
Well said. And on that note, I want to thank you for joining us on this journey into the mind of a killer. It's been a sobering experience, but I believe it's been worthwhile.
Thank you for having me. And to our listeners, remember that this conversation doesn't have to end here. Continue to learn, to ask questions, and to engage in thoughtful discussions about these important topics.